how can we burn fat? Well, that's what we all want to do. Imagine that we can somehow manipulate our meals so that we can maximize fat burning. How do we do this? Well, first of all, we have to understand what happens to our physiology when we eat. So when we eat food, the hormone insulin starts to rise. And insulin is a storage hormone. It stores some of this energy in our livers and in our fat cells. So sugar gets stored in the liver as glycogen, and fat gets stored as well. When we stop eating, the insulin levels start to fall, and what happens is that we start to bring this energy back out. So that when we're fasting, usually during sleeping, for instance, we don't have to constantly eat to feed ourselves because we're generating this energy from the fuel that we've stored away. And this is a normal situation. So you eat, energy gets stored. As you don't eat, the energy comes back out. Now, there are two main fuel sources for the body. The body can burn sugar, and the body can burn fat. And you have to understand that the body can switch from one to the other without any problems. This is a normal situation. Sugar is like the money in your wallet. It's easily available, but you can only store a certain limited amount. So you can take it in, you can take it out. It's very easy for the tissues to use. Fat, on the other hand, is like the money in your bank. There's an unlimited amount of storage, but it's not so easy to get to. You have to go to the teller. It's not immediately available to you like the money in your wallet. And this really explains partially why it's so hard to burn fat, because it's not that accessible to you. In fact, you can only get at it after you've burned through all the sugar. So what we're really talking about is how to switch over from burning sugar to burning fat. How do you do this? Well, a low carbohydrate, high fat diet is going to prevent the sugar from being stored in the first place. So if there's no sugar being stored, your body is naturally going to be able to go to the fat. But what happens if you have a lot of sugar stored already? Well, fasting is a great way to burn down all this sugar. Once you burn down all this sugar, then you can start burning fat.
Jason Fung, a nephrologist from Canada. Welcome.
Oh, thanks very much. And so I treat people on dialysis. That's a lot of what I do. And it's very disheartening because what happens is that when they develop their disease, they're so sick. But the diabetes itself is actually quite reversible. And that's one of the things that I realized a short while ago. And that's what needs to be understood, is that this is not a disease that needs to progress. But we often tell people that it's a chronic progressive disease. And that's not simply me talking, but if you go to the diabetes associations, whether it's the American Diabetes Association or the Diabetes Australia, they all put out there that this is a chronic disease. And they tell people essentially that you have diabetes, you'll have it for the rest of your life, you might as well get used to it. But the problem is that that's simply not true. And but you have to know how to reverse it. If you don't know how to reverse it, then you're just going to get worse. And the thing is that the drugs don't actually do anything for the disease. And this is also not controversial, because the thing is that type 2 diabetes is a disease of too much insulin resistance. And that's not controversial. Everybody acknowledges that, right? So if you have very high insulin resistance, it's going to cause high blood sugar, right? But that's the symptom of the disease. The disease is actually too much insulin resistance. So the treatments that we give are all targeted at blood sugar, right? That doesn't make any sense, because it's almost like, to give an analogy, if you have an infection, if you have a leg infection, well, you need to treat that infection. So what was causing it was bacteria. You give antibiotics. But that infection can give you a fever. But that fever is not the disease. If you start treating that fever as if it is the disease, then that leg wound is going to fester, because you're treating the symptoms of the disease and ignoring the disease. But that's what we've done with type 2 diabetes. We're treating the blood sugar, but it's not a disease of the blood sugar. It's a disease of too much insulin resistance. So what happens is that because we're not treating the disease, the disease tends to progress. So if you look at what happens over a period of 10 years, 15 years, what happens is that you start off with one medication, then you take 2 medications, then 3, then you take insulin, then more insulin, and more insulin. And after 10 years, you started with one medication, now you're on 100 units of insulin a day. Well, you're taking more medication to do the same job, to keep that blood sugar the same. That means your diabetes is worse. Even if your blood sugar is better, your diabetes is worse than it's ever been, because you've never actually done anything about treating the insulin resistance. So that patient who went and lost weight and exercised and cut out the carbs and cut out the sugars, they actually reversed their insulin resistance, and therefore their sugars came down, which is far different than making your blood sugars go down by force, by medication, and ignoring the actual disease. So that's the fundamental mistake that we've made over this last 20, 30, 40 years, right? We've treated the disease of type 2 diabetes, which is too much insulin, as if it was type 1 diabetes, which is too little insulin. So you got to understand that type 1 diabetes has too little insulin. So that makes sense. You should give them insulin. Type 2 diabetes is too much insulin. You need to reduce their insulin. But instead, we're giving more insulin to a disease state that has too much insulin. Well, of course, that's not going to work. That's crazy. A disease such as alcoholism, where it's characterized by too much alcohol, the very last thing you want to do is give more alcohol. And that seems very obvious, right? But if you look in the short term, as you take away the alcohol, they might get the shakes. They might get delirium tremens. If you give them alcohol, they will feel better in the short term, right? But that doesn't mean you're going to make the alcoholism better, right? That's the real problem, is the alcoholism. You can't treat the short-term thing at the expense of the long-term. What we've done is treat the short-term. We say, wow, your blood sugar is high, let me get it down, right? But it's happening to the disease. It continues to get worse. So it's just like that alcohol. Too much alcohol. The disease is too much alcohol. The cure cannot be to give more alcohol.
Right. So to be clear, giving insulin to
the disease
a common
is
type 2 diabetic is like giving alcohol to an alcoholic.
Exactly. So
and
the disease
insane.
is too much. It's insane. In fact, it's not simply that it's not treating it. It's going to actually make it worse, just like giving that alcohol. You have a disease which is characterized by too much insulin. You're giving more insulin. You're not making it better. You're actually making it worse.
So the patient will gain weight and their insulin resistance will get worse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the funny part is that the patients all know this, because this is what happens. And I talk to a lot of patients, and they say, they go to their doctor, they start insulin, then they gain 15 pounds, 20 pounds, right? Which is, we all know that happens. That's not a secret, because insulin is what really drives weight gain. So what happens is that they take the insulin, they gain weight, and they go back to the doctor and say, Doc, what's this? You tell me I need to lose weight to get better. Then you go and give me a medication that makes me gain 20 pounds. This is not good. And the doctor always says something like, well, what are you going to do? You need to take the insulin, go exercise, right? But the problem is that it was not the lack of exercise that made them gain weight. It was the insulin that made them gain weight. So you need to treat that. You need to reduce it.
So what do you do? What do you do if you're a type 2 diabetic?
Well, the thing is that it's a dietary disease, right? And if you're a type 2 diabetic, it's a dietary disease. It's a disease of essentially too much sugar. So if you understand it like that, then the answer is to get that sugar out, get it down. So the first thing you need to do is cut out all the sugar, cut out a lot of these refined carbohydrates, which are just sugar. So the breads and the pastas, right? So they're all chains of sugar. That's all carbohydrates are, chains of sugar. Fasting is actually the most efficient and the most effective way to lower insulin. There's really no drug that does it. There are actually 2, but they're not very effective to lower insulin. But if you understand that the disease is too much sugar, too much insulin, then you got to say, well, if it's too much sugar, too much insulin, let's get rid of the sugar, let's get the insulin down. How am I going to do that, right? So very low carb diet, a ketogenic diet, and that will get your sugars down. But it doesn't necessarily get your insulin down, because the proteins and the fats still raise insulin. Not to the same degree that carbohydrates do, but they still raise insulin. So you can get that sugar down, but you won't get that insulin down. So you can actually put people on various periods of fasting, because you're not taking anything. It's not simply low carb, it's low protein and low fat, right? It's nothing at all. So think about what's going to happen here. The body is not going to have anything coming in. So what it's going to happen is it's going to start burning that sugar. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we want it to do. It starts burning sugar. After it burns the sugars, your sugars come down. You don't have to take medications. You don't have to take insulin. After that, it starts burning fat. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we want to do. And there's always two questions that come up when you talk about fasting. One, can I do it? And the thing is, you have to understand is that literally billions of people around the world fast on a regular basis through their entire lives, right? So the Muslims, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Catholics, almost every major religion in the world prescribes fasting. Not because it's super harmful, because it's very beneficial. And what happens during the fast is that your insulin levels go down. Perfect. That's exactly what we want. So what we're doing is we're burning off all that sugar and getting it out of the system, right? As opposed to just getting it out of the blood, we're actually getting it out of the entire body. So the fasting does both things. It lowers the insulin and it lowers the sugars. The other thing that always comes up with fasting is it harmful? And this is what always comes up. Am I going to go into starvation mode? And what's interesting when you look at fasting is that studies of fasting show the exact opposite. You don't have less energy, you have more energy. So there are certain things that get activated when you're fasting. So growth hormone goes up, for instance, to preserve lean muscle.